right, I think it's a good time for us to go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to moderate this conversation today, and I want to thank you all for joining us. We're here in honor of a really important moment, a really heavy moment, a precious, really precious time to save our Great Salt Lake. We are all activists who are really passionate about saving the Great Salt Lake. We have our own different relationships and love of her. So I want to just take a moment just to ground us in the importance of this work and ground us in the importance of the moment. The Western Shoshone band, the Western Shoshone tribe called the Great Salt Lake Piapa, and we just honor and respect the way that she serves us. So I'm going to just share a little bit about what we hope for, and then I'll drive and have our folks introduce themselves. We want to make sure that we protect the Great Salt Lake for several reasons. The ecosystem is so delicately interconnected all across of Utah. Millions of birds travel throughout the Great Salt Lake for migration. They come to rest, they come to feed, and they travel throughout the west of the Americas, from South America, Central America, and all throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so there's bird migrations that would be affected if we would lose our lake. The dust that would cover throughout the valley from, I've seen maps that go up through Idaho, that go into Nevada, that come down into the American Fork area, that would affect millions of people if the Great Salt Lake dries up. And the health impacts that we're seeing today, we talk about asthma, the air quality, the dust storms that are happening right now with the low levels of the lake. There's a lot at stake. We're at a precious moment where there's a lot of attention behind the 2034 Olympics because our snow is also dependent on the lake. She has a great, there's a strong connection to the lake and the beautiful snow that we have, the powder effect, the lake effect affects all of that, and we're just passionate about the work to save her. So I'm going to go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start our conversation, and I'll start with Carol Lee.
All right. Hello, my name is Carol Lee Lewis. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the founding members of the Youth Coalition for Great Salt Lake. I also head up our collaboration and service department of our group. We do all kinds of work relating to Great Salt Lake. We do a lot of educational things, like panels, like going to classrooms to teach kids about the crisis. We do a lot of legislative work. We have our Youth Lobby Day coming up, for example. And when we love working with other groups. And yeah, it's just a wonderful group. There's a lot of high schoolers in there, and it's just a great time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chandler Rosenberg. I got into this as a depressed climate activist, and then as soon as I heard about the lake, wanted to do something, co-founded a group called Save Our Great Salt Lake, which was focused on coalition building, primarily awareness and education. So we used a lot of art, tried to spread awareness on social media. We do a rally for the Great Salt Lake every year. This will be our 5th coming up on Saturday if you guys are in town. So I'm still involved in that group, and then I jumped over to the policy side. So now I work on legislation and local policy with a group called Stewardship Utah. And then I'm also a co-facilitator with an initiative called Lake Time. So many of us who have been working together on Great Salt Lake for the last 5 years, it's easy to burn out, and we wanted an initiative that was, in service of this relational repair that we need for the lake, but was slower and more just rooted in our connection with each other and our connection with the lake. So we go out to the lake every second Sunday of the month and just hang out.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maysay Gonzalez, and I'm a born and raised Salt Laker who's been working on environmental advocacy for the past about 6 years now, which is crazy to say. I currently work with Green Latinos, a national environmental nonprofit, as their climate justice and clean air advocate. It's a nonprofit that focuses on the intersections of different environmental issues with the Latino community. I'm also the co-host for Stay Salty, Lake Facing Stories, a multimedia project that uplifts the stories of underrepresented individuals throughout the Valley. We have season 1 live, so I encourage everyone to check out our podcast. It's at lakefacing.org. And the podcast name is Stay Salty, Lake Facing Stories. And really exciting news, we're actually in production for season 2. So keep an ear out for our podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Catherine, she, her. I am a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, which is based in Oregon, and also the communications director for the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WeCan, which amplifies women-led solutions nationally and internationally to the climate crisis. And I actually moved to the Great Salt Lake area in 2020 and was really moved by the lake because that was really my first friend here. That's, moving in a pandemic is not easy. And every day, every week, I would go out to the lake. I would go out to the mountains, to the rivers, the waterways that feed into the water. And so, kind of just catalyzed around that. And I'm very happy to be working with the Stay Salty crew as an event curator to curate different listening sessions for community members and storytelling workshops to really, support people in telling their own stories and their own connections to the lake. So I sort of get to complement some of the work that we do with the podcast. Thanks.
You all? Absolutely. They definitely deserve a round of applause. But y'all are working incredibly hard to save the lake. What is one of the ways you see the lake crisis showing up in everyday life, especially in the ways that people outside this region may not realize?
I think one thing that is just a reminder every day is with the air quality. The air quality is very affected by the lake drying up with all the dust, like you were mentioning earlier. And it's something that I can see every day, and I am affected by it every day. Me and my family have headaches whenever the air is bad. That is very impactful, and I feel like that reminder really motivates me and a lot of other people to be working on this, and yeah, I've known about a lot of climate change and ecosystem collapses that have been happening on the horizon since I was 10 years old. I spent all of my preteens and teens with this thought of knowing that I and the people around me were going to have to put in a lot of work if we wanted a future at all. So that's kind of, yeah.
I want to direct something to Catherine. You worked on listening sessions through your work with Stay Salty. Would you be able to speak about things that people may not realize are going to affect us through what you've heard in those listening sessions?
Yeah, well, I think I did just talk to Mace a little bit about some of the sessions that we heard. And I think there's a few interesting pieces that really interweave that it's not only about, the conservation aspects, which are really important about the lake, but it's also about people's livelihoods. One of the main questions that we ask is, how do you stay when we have a collapsing ecosystem? And what does that mean when, people's children are getting asthma? I have to use an inhaler now after living here for 5 years. It's never a part of my reality. I also get headaches. And, those regular health, kind of daily health impacts that are shifting, but also, people who own property, they're having concerns around, what is the value again, when there's all this pollution, there's, there's very interesting water rights here in Utah that sort of impact how people who do own land contribute that or are unable to contribute that back to the lake. Yeah. And I think just honestly, some of the biggest points are that people want to stay here. People love it here. It's not only about recreating, it's about where they make memories, right? We heard a really amazing story of a family where it's their whole love life, their love, their romance, their family is tied to the lake. They remember on the shores where they fell in love. They remember taking their children there now, all these decades later of sharing those same places and recreating and having fun with them and making memories. And I think there's just a really important way that we're tied to the land and we're tied to the lake and the waters that is often severed under a capitalist system. Capitalism does not want us to have these sorts of ties and relationships to nature so that nature can be extracted from and so that we can extract our labor, right? And so I think when we build those and when we remind people of how they're connected to the lake, to these broader ecosystems, to these mountains, to the snow, we can really, shift how people start thinking about the lake and why people might want to care about what's happening in the legislative session, care about what it means to give or to uphold rights of nature for the lake, which is a different kind of concept that I won't get into right now, but I think we've just heard a lot from different families, from young people, students, from older people who've seen the lake change over decades' time and really want to think about it and do something about it. And I feel very honored to do that as someone who's not from here and to support people in sharing what their stories are and sharing why they care about this space. Because I care about my space. I care about where I'm from. And while I'm not from here, our ecosystems are connected. The birds are connected. The sage is connected. And so I feel very committed to how we can support people in sharing their own stories in that way.
You all do a really beautiful job. There's an episode in the Stay Salty podcast about the falling in love and the way that people fall in love with each other. Just a podcast episode on romance, but it also connects to the Great Salt Lake. You mentioned a relationship of folks who, the way that they fell in love, and you touched on that, and it's very, very tender. I think we all kind of have this love story with the lake, whether it's the itch of getting over there and the smell or the biting flies, but there's something that you love about it. You know that she's doing the work of mothering. You kind of just get this feeling of love and connection there, despite the spiders or whatever might be uncomfortable or laughable or icky. But it's there's a beauty there, I think, that you kind of feel connected to. Macy, you've spent a lot of time on the podcast interviewing people and talking to people and uplifting storytelling work. What community voices or experiences have been most important to uplift?
Yeah, definitely. So we focused a lot of the podcast on uplifting individual stories who we might not hear on the news, or there's a lot of scientists and policy experts, which are really needed, but we also do need those community perspectives. And we heard a lot from you mentioned parents talking about how it's affecting their children with the different health effects. One that's really was really close to me was a interview I got to do with a individual who's incarcerated at the Utah State Prison. So if you're not familiar, the Utah State Prison is built on the shorelines of the Great Salt Lake. And a lot of cases, individuals who are incarcerated are intentionally being ignored. Our systems aren't built to hear from them. It's we're going to put you away. So being able to speak to someone who was in that space and to see those intersections of I'm right next to the lake, it's drying, it's freaking me out, but I can't do anything, was really really intense for me to hear. And I think it was a really special episode. And it really brought up a lot of the different intersections of the drying of the Great Salt Lake. At face value, it looks like a water crisis, and it is a water crisis and a climate change crisis, but there's so many different intersections bringing in. I think housing was a huge issue that almost everyone brought up. There's this question of, as you mentioned, who gets to stay, who's forced to stay, who wants to leave, who gets to leave. Yeah. And it's not easy to just uproot your whole life if you built it here, especially with how inaccessible housing is right now. Healthcare is getting really accessible as well. And also just the state's political environment that we're in right now. A lot of individuals talked about they don't feel welcomed here anymore, whether that's with policies on LGBTQ issues or immigrants. So intersect that with a drying lake that's poisoning our air. You feel like I should leave, but it's not that easy.
Yeah, especially if you don't have the means or opportunities. What Catherine mentioned about moving here and getting diagnosed with asthma or needing an inhaler, I experienced that myself. This is the things that you just don't think about that happen here, and this is before it's dried up that asthma rates are rising. Chandler, what do these lived experiences tell us about the failures or limits of our systems?
Yeah, I think that there are failures and limits to our systems. I think that what's so cool about this issue to me and like the attention on Great Salt Lake is it's given us this chance to have these massive conversations about systems, about interconnectedness, about intersectionality that I don't know that we otherwise would have been having at this scale if it were not for Great Salt Lake. So, people are talking about everything from like how the magnesium plant at the lake is tied to the weapons that are being sent to Palestine, or, our governments are actually quite limited in their ability to move quickly. And I think just like that systemic understanding that we now all have and the questions that we're asking is really interesting. And then like Catherine mentioned, the interconnectedness, I think we're able to really have this conversation of like our health is the same as the lake's health, which is, maybe previously was reserved for environmental circles or progressive circles, and like everyone, our Republican governor is saying that. So I think it's really pushed us forward to talk about these things that we need to talk about culturally. And I really feel like we are like I don't know if like hotbed's the right word, but like we're having some really interesting conversations about like systemic collapse, climate collapse here through the lens of the lake. And I think the lake offers an entry point for people that's really tangible and local, but really to me this issue is much, much bigger.
The hope is that it's something that people can rally behind, and amongst the intersections of the issues of poverty, of race, of our fight for queer rights here in a state like Utah, it is something that grounds us in like we need a place to stay to have these fights and have these conversations. So perhaps we can push the needle forward with the way that we drive our conversations about the lake. So the next body of questions I want to talk about are about storytelling, youth power, and narrative change. So stories shape who feels responsible for the crisis, right? And who feels empowered to act. So how does narrative help shift power? And I'd like to start with Carol Lee again. How have stories influenced Carol Lee, how are young people using storytelling, through your work as a youth activist?
Yeah, I would say that like there's a lot of even just in the context of just conversations with amongst people and amongst my peers, there's a lot of us talking about and like telling the story of our future, of like if we're to live here for a long term, like what does that look like? What pathways could we go, and how are we gonna get there? And I feel like the way that we have these conversations really impacts, like what everyone's been saying, it really impacts how motivated people are. If people talk about it like it's a done deal, like it's drying up and what are we gonna do, then you're not gonna like think that there's anything that you can help with. And I feel like the frequency in which consistency in which we are bringing stuff up and reminded of things really helps with feeling motivated. So I feel like, as far as especially, not surprisingly, I feel like social media is a huge tool for telling the story and getting the information out there. That's like a lot of people are on there. That's a lot of how I was informed. I found out about the Great Salt Lake rally on social media, and that was like the first thing I ever did was go to that, and then got involved through there. But yeah, I feel like the way we word things in our everyday conversations is like a huge part of how we're seeing things.
Yeah, that constant pressure, right? That positive framing around what we can do for the lake, because it's not like if or maybe we have to. We need a place to stay. Catherine, dominant narratives reflect power dynamics. Where do you think we're going?
Let's get into that.
Easy.
Yeah, no, we were talking in the carpool we had earlier today about a really powerful event earlier this Sundance week from the African American Policy Forum that was moderated by Kimberly Crenshaw. And one of the things that I've been really thinking about is how dominant systems, dominant power, leadership right now is erasing certain histories, and that happens, that has happened throughout history as well, from authoritarian governments and regimes, and seeking to erase our histories, right? That happened with Indigenous people, that's happened with Black and Brown people, and queer folks, all sorts of different people with different identities that don't maintain the hegemony that is maintaining the power structures that we're seeing today. And so I think when we tell our stories, we inherently are challenging the stories that dominant powers are giving us. And through our first season, actually, we interview Maysay and Olivia, who's in the back, also one of the podcast hosts, several Indigenous tribal leaders from this area, from the Shoshone and Ute tribes. And I think something that's really important that I was listening to, I actually listened to them before we got here just because I wanted to, really be grounded in the stories of the people who have called this region home since time immemorial and who are also the stewards of this place, despite being removed, despite a lot of colonial powers trying to sever that relationship. And I think something that's really important that has stood out to me when I was listening to those is one, what's happening with the lake is not something that's just happening. It is a policy decision, and it's a colonial policy decision that is the result of centuries of colonization in this area and also nationally, right? And we get into the global part, but not right now. And so, I think when we look at that history, we can see, okay, what are these other colonial practices that have contributed to the environmental crisis we're in, but also to the interconnected pieces of, Indigenous communities being removed from their lands, the way that water rights and agriculture are maintained in this state, which is also, again, not good for the lake and not good for communities. And another side of that is that Indigenous communities are, again, the best stewards of the places that they call home. They know these places. They know the names of these places. They have spoken to these places for their entire existence. And so why are we not listening to them? And why not give them back their land? So this is another PA for land back. Sorry, guys. But, there's actually a really great project happening up at Bear River by the Shoshone tribe. They bought back land. And Bear River is one of the main tributaries, or waterways, that's feeding into the lake. And they are restoring that, not only culturally, bringing back, cultural practices that happen on that land, but also restoring the land after degradation due to big agriculture, and the waterways for the same reason. And their goal, they estimate that 13,000 acre feet of water will be returned back to the lake. And that is because we are trusting Indigenous people. Well, not us, they did it themselves, right? That's because they took action to say, this is our land and we're gonna take care of it how we know to take care of it. And so I think even in that story, we can see how that is not only challenging power, but transforming power and showing what we can do when we listen to the people who know these areas best.
They're doing amazing work that happens in November where they have hundreds of people come plant thousands of native plants. And native plants, I think, may be the key to what's restoring the water back to the Great Salt Lake, because of the way that the native plants use water and bring it back and just naturally divert it back to the river systems. There's the Russian olive, and I think it's phalanges, that have been invasively brought into our waterways, and they're particularly along the Jordan River, which is also a tributary to the Great Salt Lake, are taking thousands of acre feet from the water just by having those invasive species there. So there's something powerful about putting the power into the hands of the Indigenous folks who know how to steward this land. Chandler, how have stories influenced policy conversations?
Yeah, stories drive everything, right? I actually think we have not quite figured out the right story to support effective policymaking. Not to say there haven't been some good things done, but I think we're kind of locked into this us versus them narrative. Like, oh, the lake's not saved, that must mean the decision makers hate the lake, and it's this real us versus them, which I think is really unhelpful because it breeds a lot of antagonism from our community against the decision makers. It breeds mistrust, and then they
are afraid to talk about anything with us because, they think we're going to call them out. And so then there's this absence of transparency. We're not, we don't have open forums to create policy. And I think we cling on to that us versus them because it's much easier to say that, we're right, we have the right ideas. Well, as soon as they listen to us, we'll figure this out. Really, the story in my mind is like, this is harder than anything we've tried to do as a state, and we don't actually know how to do this. It's never been done. No community has ever saved their saline lake. And I try to tell my friends that work for the state, like, if the state just came out and admitted how hard this is and how big of a task this was and that they need help, like, I think that the community would really sympathize and understand, like, we're all in this together. Like, we can't afford to have that division. And then I think the other story we really see is it's farmers. It's on farmers to save the lake, and farmers are the problem. For those who don't know, so agriculture uses the majority of water in the Great Salt Lake Basin, about 65%, which, yes, is absolutely something we need to change. But again, I think like we urbanites in Salt Lake City are quick to cling on to that because it's an easy narrative to say, it's their fault, it's not us, they have to change, we don't, when really like all of us need to be involved in even the food system change. Like that's gonna take changing markets, changing supply chains, changing consumer habits. But I think we're so afraid of this crisis, and it is so terrifying that like we're quick to grasp, we want an easy answer, and there isn't one.
No, there's no easy answer, and we're also on an intense time crunch in order to create changes in policy.
Pressure cooker.
Yeah, it is a very pressure cooker moment. Carolee, how are young people using storytelling media, social media, and peer networks to bring momentum and help put pressure?
I would say that there's a lot of, I feel a lot of like rallying energy amongst a lot of my peers. Like a lot of us are like very, very down to like want to be helpful and care. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can really help. I think a lot of us saying our stories to older generations has been very impactful. There's also like within my group, there's been a lot of doors that have opened to us because we are a youth group, and us walking into spaces saying, hey, we are all young people who really care. Like, can we talk to you? Even the people who like usually do not want to talk to like environmentalist people, and they will listen to us and listen to our stories, which sometimes I'm like, okay, you should listen to everybody, but I am I'm glad to get the opportunity. But I think also even through other forms of art, I see a lot of art. I see lots at like art markets and things, and on social media there's so many like prints and stickers and things of like celebrating the beautiful things about this ecosystem of the brine shrimp and the water and everything. And I think like that ties into the story and like the culture of like, oh, we care about this is a beautiful place, we love to be here, and like there's so much joy to be found in this place and in this work.
And Macy, I'll have you wrap up this section with just talking about a little bit more about frontline communities. You spoke about an interview with someone who was incarcerated and with their adjacency to the Great Salt Lake. Do you have anything else to add about frontline communities and their storytelling?
Yeah, definitely. I think it all goes down to like that narrative piece, and I think whoever has the mic sometimes feels like the most credible, and we've given the mic a lot to the lawmakers, to the scientists, to those technical experts, and again, very needed. I love a graph. It's very needed in this space. But handing over that mic to community members makes them feel credible and kind of assures that, yes, what you are seeing and what your solutions that you're bringing to the table should be involved in this space. And when we intentionally center frontline communities, not as supporting characters, but as like the leading piece, we can really find some of these solutions to mitigate other harms. So these top-down approaches, in a lot of cases, create a lot of environmental injustices, which is, we'll get into that probably in another question, but we create more harm sometimes by not going to community first and seeing what's going on and understanding not only their grief and the harm that's happening, but also the joy to make sure we don't take that away.
To speak to the joy, there are activists who every morning get up during legislative session at 8 a.m. They walk. They do what they call walk the waves. If I'm not mistaken, like 2 years ago, they did it every day, 8 a.m. They did art builds, and they have these gorgeous wave and cloths, and they have costumes that they were wearing of brine shrimp and different animals and birds that you would commonly see at the lake. They would go to our state capitol building where our legislators are meeting and convening during our session, and they would honor the lake and help us. They would hold visual and hold space for the lake in hope that we would be reminding ourselves to have that top of mind. And they're in their third year of that work. Right now they hold vigil on Monday morning, and they hold vigil on Friday evening. So if you'd like to take a moment and go to the Capitol and walk with them and join them, we can give you that information, because right now it's during our legislative session. But everyone doing what they can, and the different types of action, whether it's policy or storytelling or art, I think they're all inspiring some hope in myself. So we're going to shift over to some of the solutions, and I've got some individual questions for y'all. I'll start with Chandler. How can policy and advocacy efforts better integrate community stories? So how do these efforts help us lift the stories of lived experience and help our decision makers understand just long-term and intergenerational impacts?
Yeah, I'm constantly thinking about like how do we create the forums to bring together policymakers and community members so we can have these conversations about like what is it that community members actually want, rather than like what are the tiny tweaks that legislators want to make. And that's been challenging to do. So this summer we have a People's Great Salt Lake Summit every summer, and I tried to put on a panel with state leaders and decision makers to be like, hey, community, look, they care about the lake. They're just dealing with, some very real capacity constraints. They're understaffed. And because of something that, one of the community groups involved said to the media, they all had to pull out. And so like we're still trying to figure out where we can bring these people together and so they're comfortable to have these conversations and hear each other out, because right now I think there's just a lot of back and forth because that trust hasn't been built. But I think ultimately like the goal is to have the community be driving the policy agenda. And I think right now we're a little bit in the world of like, what are the short-term, maybe more reactive solutions or policy ideas to get water to the lake, which of course that's what we need. This is an emergency, but I think it does distract us. I think if we ask community members what they want, it would be more of the deeper long-term systemic change type stuff, which, takes a long time, but we need to start now, So I think we did something a few years ago up at the Capitol where after our first legislative session, we were just like, oh my God, we fought like hell for nothing, like pennies, nothing that really affected the lake. And we were like, what if we were to put our energy into what we actually wanted and just like articulate our demands? So we made a Great Salt Lake to-do list. You can see it online still. And just listed, land back was on there, co-management and co-stewardship with tribes, like transforming our agriculture system, just these big ideas, which, we didn't have, the next steps, but we wanted to just start getting that out there and like controlling our own narrative. So I think that's really important is, how can the community continue to share what it is that we want and then, eventually work towards that.
I'll move to Macy. How can place-based storytelling, like your work with the Great Salt Lake, resonate with audiences and strengthen the environmental justice movement across regions?
Yeah, definitely. I think give a little bit of a one-on-one on environmental justice, but environmental justice at its core means that no community bears a disproportionate effect of environmental harms, and that communities have a real voice in the decisions being made. So that's kind of the big piece of environmental justice, is making sure that when we pass a policy, it doesn't save this community and then does something bad over here. And I think many of these, again, injustices happen because of that top-down approach, and having that community members voice out what they need, be brought into spaces where those decisions are being made, or make their own spaces to create those solutions are really important. I think sometimes we lean a little too heavy on legislative efforts, thinking it's going to solve all the problems, but working up there, it's not. A lot of this stuff takes a long time. I'm still wondering some of the bills that when I was working up at the Hill like 3 years ago, where they're at, where the progress is, I don't know. A lot of the times they kind of fizzle out and we don't know what happens with them. So we can't rely on the legislative body and our system sometimes, because as we acknowledge, they're broken. So finding different ways through community I think is really important to drive environmental justice. And that looks like mutual aid right now in a lot of spaces. I think that's been a really important one. We've been seeing a lot of attacks from our government for different areas, and I think that's the same for the environmental space, is how can we show up for each other, and what resources do I have that can help out my neighbors or individuals facing environmental and other impacts.
I'd like to just get a raise of hands in the audience. Who considers himself an activist, whether that's for racial justice, women's health, whether that's for queer voices?
We're in the right.
Yeehaw!
We're in the right room. How do we create time and space, may say, for environmental justice issues? Oftentimes, we might be fighting for the right to an abortion, or we're fighting for racial justice, especially in a state like Utah, where they've demonized DEI and repealed so many opportunities for folks at the state level, or for queer justice, where in a state like Utah, where they have stripped us of dignity of bathrooms for folks to be in, and they're just indignity after indignity that's happening here. How do we carve a little bit of time for the environmental justice movement?
I think this is a hard one because I have to think about this all the time.
Yeah.
First of all, take care of yourself first. Like, I think rest is a huge piece, and making sure that you're able to process this, because this is all traumatic. All these issues happening aren't something that you can just wake up and say, I'm gonna go ahead and fight. Like, take the time to grieve what's happening, see how it's affecting you, and making sure that you're okay. And in a lot of cases, how I kind of go about it is just showing up. I might not be an expert on abortions or different issues, but I know it's affecting a community member, it's affecting someone that I love, and just being there and being able to have a hand to say, what do you need help with, I think is a big piece. I think many times we feel like we have to be the perfect activist, like know all the facts of this issue, show up to the protest knowing X, Y, and Z of it, but I think just showing up, being vulnerable, being like, I'm not an expert, but I see the pain, and I want to be able to take away a little bit of that pain is really important.
I think we all feel that in this moment. I've mentioned so many movements. There's so many painful things that are going on with ICE right now. It's a really tough moment, and we are all breathing deeply and breathing heavy. But I think just that how are you question to your neighbor, I think, is an important start, or just checking in and making sure you're well and showing up with a lot of humility and vulnerability, I think right now, is really, really important. Carolee, let's hear from your youth perspective. Young people are often shaping culture before institutions respond. How are youth using creativity to influence policymakers?
I don't know. It is hard to say. I feel like I agree with that. It's like, it's still a process of like, how do we go about things and how do we phrase things better? And I do feel like, like a lot of the ground up approach is a lot of what I feel connected to doing. And I feel like, I don't know, just like the more that people can just make sure that they're still talking about it, and if it's affecting you every day, we should be talking about it every day. Like, have you talked to your parents? Have you talked to your kids? Have you talked to your neighbor? Like, and it really doesn't have to be perfect thing. You really don't need to like be as involved as I am, or as we all are. Like, as long as you're imperfectly talking about it and being like, this is what I'm feeling, I've been hearing about this going on and I'm worried about it, and like getting this sense of like, again, it's like sense of community and culture of like, we are all here together and we are all worried together. And I guess from like youth perspectives, I feel like youth and younger generations are known for being a lot of like change makers and culture builders, and like just known for like picking up on things really quickly and getting on board with things really quickly and having the energy. And so I would just say, I don't know, like if you're a young person, if you have young people in your lives, really like encourage them to feel empowered to be involved and tell them that like you see them and this is a really hard time, and that like their voices are powerful and there's a lot to bring in so many ways.
We lost Jane Goodall this year, and she is really in like rotation right now. You can hear podcast, or her book has been lifted up in certain spaces, and she has a message for organizers and activists that movement is at the heart of hope. Just the work that activists do creates spark and creates that push for change. And so it's really, really just powerful. If there's anything that can give us hope in this moment, is just that movement and work forward. And Catherine, do you have anything else to add to some of the solutions and storytelling and movement building work that you've been doing?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I appreciate you sharing that quote on hope, because I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as we see the really beautiful kind of community networks come in Minnesota that have, they've established those. If you look at the history, they really talk about how that was established, kind of during the George Floyd protests and all of those different things, and how that's really coming to fruition again to protect communities. And so I find just a ton of hope in how we can kind of bridge together and think about it not as environmental justice, racial justice, as social justice, but as justice simply, right? That we are advocating for justice for everybody and for the ecosystems that we're a part of. And so I think, that's just something that I am often considering, especially when we're hearing these different stories that are maybe sharing, in different ways, as Maysay said, from different perspectives, from different communities, is not thinking of it as, oh, this story is about only, someone who is incarcerated, or this story is only about an Indigenous person. It's like, this story is about all of us, and it's a little bit broader than that. And it's also looking at, and again, challenging those systems that lie at the root of the crisis that the Great Salt Lake is facing, are these environmental crises, but also lies at the root of, the terrible immigration policy, if we want to call it that, that we're experiencing right now, that lie at the root of anti-trans bills. And so when we work together to address these different challenges is not even the right word, it's like atrocities towards different members of our communities, then we are collectively working towards justice, which includes environmental justice. And so I think that is something that's powerful when we share our collective stories, and when we work with people who are different than ourselves too. Like, I'm just thinking a lot of my friends here actually focus more on those anti-trans bills, and I'm the one coming in being like, let's talk about lithium mining on the lake, and they're telling me what we can do about, different anti-trans rights, or how we can work together around, mutual aid networks regarding immigration. So I think it's also about broadening those perspectives in our communities and kind of building just community broadly, because that is, again, something that is taken away from us through a capitalist policy and framework, is to isolate ourselves. And honestly, like, community is the antidote, like, so clearly every time we're doing it, it's like, look, we're showing up, we're pulling up, we're coming together to stop terrible things from happening. And I don't think it needs to be, when we're in that sort of kinship with each other, we can really pull on each other when there are crises that emerge, right? When it is people being taken away, snatched from their houses, from their cars, or when it's, okay, there's a huge inversion coming, how are we supporting each other, getting each other masks, supporting people who can't go outside because of their different health issues. So I think it's about that community and how we show up.
As movement organizers, I know I hear oftentimes, like, what animal are you would you be in the ecosystem of the movement? And I like to say an ant, because I like to work really hard, and sometimes I'm just too diligent. I'm just trudging through, and I could have been a little more efficient, whatever. But everybody has their role. Everybody is, and you want to be who you are in the movement. You know, you want to be that person who's standing up for trans right, or you want to be that person who's organizing in your neighborhood around ICE. You want to really be that person in the movement, in the moment, and you don't have to be the person who's going down to protest against energy solutions adjacent to the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, or you don't have to go and be that person who's fighting for Black lives. But you can please be in solidarity. Please be in movement. Please be together. Please be in community. We are better when we are in our roles and working together. We don't need the hand to do what the eye does, but it still needs to be together for the body and for the community. And I just want to just make a plug for just how powerful community is. Well, our last question, I think, is, do we have 10 minutes? We'll do our best. But our last question is going to make us look forward and look into the future. What do you all want to see in 10 years? What do you all want us to see? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What is the story we want to be able to tell about our beautiful Great Salt Lake in the next 10 years? And I'll let y'all pop in as you feel ready.
I think we're telling a story that the living world is alive. I mean, the living world is alive now, but we have shifted our culture to recognize that. We have shifted our systems, especially our economies, to recognize that. We've aligned our economies with our ecologies. You know, we've learned to reckon with limits. We understand that we live in a desert and we can't grow infinitely. Yeah, we have a strong relationship with the lake. I certainly, no one knows how this goes, and I think it almost doesn't matter. I always talk about, I think investing in process. We don't need to know how this ends to know what the next right thing to do is. We can align with our values and then just kind of ask, okay, if these are the things we believe, if we believe that our health is connected to the health of the lake, if we believe that, we want systems that are not built on exploitation, then what are we to do? Who are we to be in that? So.
Thank you.
Maybe I can go next. I want to tell a happy story, obviously, but I also want to be able to tell a story that's really honest, to say, it was a scary time and there was lots of failures and, we didn't get it right the first time, but we kept trying. I think that's really important. I want to make sure that we highlight the communities that were in the front lines of this issue. I think they're leading a lot of the change and a lot of the organizing. So I definitely want to make sure that they're included in that story and they're centered in that story, not as a little, what is it called? A little footnote, and these people helped out with this. No, these people led the change. So I really just want to make sure that, yes, again, that graph is there with the policymaker and that fancy picture of the Capitol, but that community is also at that story.
I am in Macy's dream as well. And maybe, to just build off of the beauty that you just shared. I do think there is a very true reality of the climate crisis is here and the impacts of nearing 1.5 degrees are real, and we're facing that every day, and it's not going to get better in 10 years. And so I think one thing that I really hold on to and have been thinking about is, what does climate resilience look like? We can't change those things. Unfortunately, we can't change those things in a year or even a decade, but we know what's coming and we know how we can prepare and build and how we can support communities who are closest to the lake, who are experiencing firsthand those impacts, and that we can develop what we need to address what's coming. And I think that's really powerful. And in my heart, I do think that we'll have more water in the lake. I think we'll be able to breathe. I can see how we can make those changes. And there's also the very true reality of the climate crisis is here, and we don't know all 100% what those impacts are going to be, but we can build what we need to address those. And so in 10 years, I want stories of climate resilience, of a just transition that does not include lithium mining or extraction from the lake, that lets the lake thrive, that lets the lake restore and return, and allows our communities to thrive and restore and return to.
Carolee, we'll let you wrap us up.
I would say, along with all of those things, I would want Like, I want more houses and more outdoor spaces with full native plants. As we're going into the crisis, like, how are we taking care of each other, but how are we gonna make safe havens and safe zones for all of our like native animals here? You know, how are we gonna have more lawns and park spaces transform? How are you gonna have more farms and agricultural spaces transform to indigenous systems of agriculture? I don't know that we would get all of that done in 10 years, but we can certainly get a lot of movement going, and that'd be great. And just, yeah, I want to see kids, when they start learning about animals, I want them to learn about the animals in the area that they live in first. And they should know what plants are here. They should know the names of the specific birds that are here. I think a lot about like childhood education and what stories are we telling kids and how that's gonna shape things. But yeah.
Thanks for bringing in that connection to our wildlife, our animal friends, our plant friends. They're depending on us too. We got a time check. Would you be able to go to the slide that has the QR code? Yeah. Thank you. Do we need to go through any other slides? Okay. All right, so we talked about 10 years. We talked about 10 years from now. And 10 years from now will be 2036. Okay, so 2034, we're gonna have the Olympics here.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I thought we were in 2016, actually. No.
No, I thought it was 2006. You know, I feel, whoa, right? Time is moving so fast. Okay, so 2034 is coming in like 8 years. And this is the intensity of the time crunch. We say 10 years, and it's after the Olympics are supposed to be here. So if y'all can talk about where this QR code takes us and how can folks act and support the work you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. I can take a stab at it. So this QR code takes you to the first season of Stay Salty Lake Facing Stories. So you get to hear about all those stories we kind of mentioned. There's 11 episodes for season 1. And on there as well, it takes you to the blog post at how we got all of the stories and just a little bit more information on there. We are going to also publish season 2 on that QR code. So definitely have a listen, and I can pass it to everyone for their own respective pieces. If you guys are interested in Green Latinos, we're at greenlatinos.org. That's where a lot of our work on a federal side works.
And maybe I'll just come in quickly on the Stay Salty piece. We are going to have a lot of storytelling events and sessions this coming spring and summer. So would really encourage, if you are a Utah resident or you want to fly back and hang out with us, we're going to have a lot of really wonderful opportunities that, again, complement the podcast and kind of bring in that community storytelling aspects. And I do work at WeCan. We don't do work explicitly in Utah, but we do a lot of national and international work around food sovereignty, forest protection, political advocacy. So you can always check us out. It's WeCan_INTL. Okay.
Yeah, happy to go next. So this is my personal Instagram, or you can check out Save Our Great Salt Lake on Instagram for updates on the lake movement, or saveourgreatsaltlake.org, as well as Stewardship Utah. That is where I work. We do environmental policy and elections.
And they have a rally this Saturday.
You can check out the posters. You can take a poster. It'll be amazing.
Yeah, so this is the @ for my group's, is it the Instagram? That's the one, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so you can find updates about things that we're doing there. We also try to share a lot about what other Great Salt Lake orgs are doing and what's going on. But yeah. Oh, yeah, we have a youth lobby day. So if you coming up on February 12th. So if you have any young people who want to learn how to lobby the legislature, that would be a great opportunity to do that.
We used up our time for questions. We're going to be around during the transition between talks. So yeah, if we wanted just to be in the back, y'all can ask us questions and just talk, engage with us. Let's build community.
FYI for the group, Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment will be releasing a feature-length documentary this fall on Great Salt Lake.
Yes. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much.